For 6 months, Kade came to Perugia like a phantom. He never tried to capture her. He never attempted to force her back to the sanctuary. Instead, he simply appeared, on the street corner where she walked to work, in the market where she bought bread, outside the inn where she lived. He would watch her with that beautiful, predatory smile, and then he would speak. "Still pretending to be human?" he'd ask one day, materializing beside her as she carried wine bottles. "Still believing that running into a city full of ordinary people will protect you from what you are?" Another day he'd shown her daguerreotypes, photographs of the females from the sanctuary, newly positioned with new alphas, their eyes empty and compliant. "They're thriving in their proper place," he'd said, his voice soft with false sympathy. Once they accepted what they were meant to be, the suffering stopped. They found peace in submission. "You could too, Sera. You could come back to me, and I would teach you that same peace." The worst part was that she'd started believing him. Not about submission, never that again, but about the impossibility of escape. The paranormal world had roots that ran too deep. Hiding in human society was just a temporary illusion. Sooner or later, someone would discover what she was. Someone would hunt her, and she would have nowhere left to run. By the 6th month, Sera was exhausted. Not physically, but spiritually. The constant fear, the psychological warfare, the knowledge that her freedom was an illusion. It was breaking her down all over again. She'd wake up in her small room above the inn and wonder if there was any point to surviving at all. Nabi had been watching her since the day she'd walked into the inn asking for work. He'd seen the paranormal exhaustion in her bearing, the way her wolf consciousness was wounded but still alive inside her. He'd recognized the specific trauma of someone who'd been bonded, the way she sometimes flinched at touch, the way her eyes sometimes reflected predatory awareness before she could hide it. For 6 months, he'd observed her carefully, watched as she rebuilt a fragile human life, watched as Kade had appeared again and again to torment her with reminders of what she couldn't escape, watched as hope had slowly drained from her expression, replaced by quiet desperation. Nabi had been an outcast werewolf for 8 years. He'd rejected his family pack when he'd discovered what they were doing, trading females between families like currency, running the same trafficking networks that Kade operated. He'd walked away, found his way to Perugia, bought the inn with money he'd saved, and started building something different. A sanctuary for werewolves who wanted to escape. An underground network, the Outcasts Pack. 15 other werewolves lived hidden lives in Perugia, working as servants, merchants, laborers, bonded to each other by choice, not by supernatural compulsion, living freely if quietly. When Sera had arrived, Nabi had recognized immediately what she was and what she'd endured. He'd also recognized something else. She had the skills, the access, the motive needed for something he'd been planning for years. But trust had to come first. And trust meant watching her break down, then showing her there was another way. It meant revealing himself at exactly the right moment. Nabi came to her on the evening of the 6th month. Sera was working alone in the inn's kitchen, mechanically preparing food while her mind was elsewhere, in that dark place where all her thoughts had been lately. He locked the back door and spoke in the Tuscan dialect, but underneath his words was something else. The unmistakable alpha presence she'd learned to recognize. The resonance of werewolf to werewolf. "I'm going to tell you what I am," he said quietly, "and then I'm going to tell you what I've been watching you become for the past 6 months. And then I'm going to offer you something that might be the only real choice you've had since you escaped that palazzo." She turned to look at him fully for the first time, seeing past the innkeeper facade. My name is Nabi. 15 years ago, I was part of a family pack, not Ravello but connected to them. I discovered they were running trafficking operations. I refused to participate. They hunted me. I escaped to Perugia and built something different. He paused, letting her process. I run an underground network of werewolves who rejected their family packs. We call ourselves outcasts. We're bonded by choice, not by supernatural compulsion. We help each other survive and, eventually, we fight back. Sera's breathing had become shallow. Why are you telling me this? Because you've been watched by Kade for 6 months, Nabi continued. And instead of breaking completely, you've been getting angry. Your anger is still there, underneath the fear. And I think that anger might be the most dangerous thing Kade could have awakened in you. He stepped closer. I'm offering you a choice, Sera. Stay here, hide, wait for Kade to eventually capture you or break you. Or come with me, join the outcasts, learn to fight, learn to become something so lethal that predators will think twice before hunting you ever again. The Outcasts Pack met in the cellar of Nabi's inn, in a space hidden behind false walls that no human would ever discover. When Nabi took her down there, Sera's wolf consciousness immediately registered what she was seeing. 14 other werewolves, all watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to skepticism to something that looked like kinship. Everyone, Nabi said, his voice carrying that subtle alpha resonance. This is Sera. She was bonded against her will to a Ravello cadet. She escaped. She's been hunted. And she's angry enough that she might be willing to stop running. A female with deep scarring across her shoulders stepped forward. I'm Mara. Escaped from the Visconti family in Milan. Bonded for 5 years before I could break the connection. Another male, younger, with haunted eyes. I'm Carlo. I was being prepared for trafficking when Nabi found me. One by one, they told their stories. A merchant who'd rejected his family. A servant who'd learned her wolf form was being hidden from her own family. A healer who'd been captured during a paranormal dispute. Each had their own trauma, their own escape story, their own reason for joining the outcasts. But there was something different about this group compared to what she'd experienced in Kade's sanctuary. These werewolves looked at each other with genuine care, not dependency. They moved with choice in their bodies, not compulsion. They were bonded, but to something that felt like actual community. For the first time since her escape, Sera felt something shift inside her. Not hope, hope seemed too fragile a word, but possibility. The possibility that there might be werewolves in the world who weren't predators. Who understood freedom not as an illusion but as something worth fighting for. Later that night, after the others had dispersed, Nabi took Sera to his private chamber in the inn. He poured wine and sat across from her with an expression that was both gentle and calculating. I need to be honest with you about why I'm really telling you all this, he said. For 3 years, the outcasts have been planning something. We want to infiltrate the Ravello Palazzo. We want to identify everyone involved in the trafficking network. And we want to burn it down from the inside. Sera's wolf consciousness jolted at his words. Why? Because there are families. Because we've tried to escape, but the system keeps hunting us. Because every female they capture and process is one of us. And because Kade has expanded beyond just the sanctuary. He's running operations out of the palazzo itself now. Multiple locations. Dozens of females being held. Nabi leaned forward. We've been waiting for the right person. Someone with legitimate access to the palazzo. Someone with a personal connection to someone inside. Someone with enough rage to sustain them through what would essentially be a suicide mission. He paused. You're that person. Cus still considers you his property. He still wants to reclaim you. If you go back, if you present yourself as remorseful, broken, seeking asylum, he'll take you in. His ego won't allow him to refuse. And once you're inside, you'll have access to places, information, people that we could never reach. Sera understood immediately what he was proposing. It wasn't just training. It wasn't just self-defense. It was war. And he was asking her to be the soldier who walked into the heart of enemy territory, fully aware she might never come out. If I do this, Sera said slowly, I don't just want to escape again. I don't want to run. I want them to understand what they've done. I want them to understand what they've built and what it costs. That's what we want too. But I need to be honest about the cost to you. If you do this, you'll need to become something. Not just a fighter. A weapon. A predator who can move through their world without them understanding what you are until it's too late. You're asking me to become like them, Sera said. I'm asking you to become powerful enough that you never have to submit to them again, Nabi corrected. Whether that makes you like them or better than them, that's something only you can decide. For a long moment, Sera sat with that. The choice was clearer now than it had been in months. She could stay in Perugia, keep hiding, keep waiting for Kade to eventually wear her down. Or she could choose to become something dangerous. She could choose to fight. She could choose to end this even if the ending meant she had to do terrible things. Even if the ending meant she became something she was afraid of. Teach me, she said finally. Make me lethal. And then we burn it all down. The training began the next day and didn't stop for 2 months. Every morning before the inn opened, Nabi worked with her on transformation. Not just shifting into wolf form that had become easier over time, but controlling it completely. Moving between human and wolf form with fluid grace. Calling her wolf consciousness forward without losing her human awareness. Creating a state of existence that was neither fully human nor fully wolf, but something in between. A predator who could think like a human and move like a beast. The physical training was brutal. Hours in wolf form, learning to move with impossible speed. Practicing supernatural combat against the other outcasts. Feeling her body respond to threats with instincts she'd buried during captivity. Her bones were stronger than she'd known. Her reflexes faster. Her senses could pierce darkness and distance in ways that human consciousness couldn't even comprehend. She learned that her wolf had gifts she'd never been allowed to explore. Gifts that Krace and Kade had wanted to suppress, because a female with access to her own power was dangerous to their system. Day by day, Sera could feel the transformation happening. Her human body was becoming more efficient, more dangerous. Her wolf consciousness was no longer hiding in fear but rising to meet the challenge. She was becoming something new. Not victim, not survivor, but predator. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a nightmare. Felt like justice. The physical training was only the beginning. Nabi also taught her strategy. How to move through the palazzo without being detected. How to identify the security systems, both the visible guards and the paranormal wards that protected the family's secrets. How to gather information without revealing what she knew. How to recognize which alphas were dangerous enough to kill and which ones could be incapacitated without fatal force. They studied maps of the Ravello estate obsessively. Nabi had contacts, servants, merchants, travelers, who'd provided detailed information about the palazzo's layout, its routines, its vulnerabilities. There was a servant entrance that wasn't magically warded. There were chambers in the lower levels where the trafficking operations happened. There was a central courtyard that connected to escape routes through the surrounding grounds. How to identify an alpha's weaknesses. How to move with intention so that werewolves tracking her by scent would be confused about her direction. How to use the environment in a fight. How to think like a warrior, not just a survivor. But more than the physical and tactical training, Nabi taught her something harder. How to suppress her own emotional reactions enough to function as an operative. How to maintain a facade of submission while her wolf consciousness was planning destruction. How to be in a room with her abuser and show fear while actually calculating his death. By the end of the second month, Nabi saw something shift in Sera that even she might not have recognized yet. She was no longer a traumatized survivor learning to defend herself. She was becoming a weapon, a shadow predator, a lethal operative with a personal vendetta and the skills to execute it. One night, as they trained in the hidden courtyard beneath the inn, Nabi watched her move through combat scenarios with fluid grace, shifting between human cunning and wolf instinct, using her intelligence to set traps, then using her supernatural strength to execute them, moving like darkness itself. When the training session ended, Nabi found himself looking at her differently, not with the protective concern he'd felt before, but with something more complex. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition that she was becoming something extraordinary and something dangerous. "Do you know what you're becoming?" he asked her as she stood, breathing hard, no longer entirely human in her bearing. That's what Mara called it, a werewolf so skilled in infiltration and combat that they become like a shadow, invisible until they strike. "Yes," Nabi said slowly. "But shadows serve darkness, and I'm starting to wonder if we're asking you to become so dark that you might not be able to find your way back to the light once this is finished." Sera looked at him with eyes that reflected predatory intelligence. "I stopped believing in the light months ago," she said quietly. "The only question that matters now is whether we can use the darkness to burn down the people who taught me to live in it." Later that night, alone in his chamber, Nabi made a confession that would have contradicted everything he'd been telling himself about his intentions. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice was stripped of its usual careful control. "When I started watching you, when I first thought about whether you could be the operative we needed for this mission, I told myself it was because you had the skills, the access, the motive. But that wasn't entirely true. I was also using you, using the fact that you were broken, using the fact that you had nowhere else to go, using the fact that your desperation made you willing to become something lethal rather than remain something powerless." He paused, looking at her with eyes that were unexpectedly vulnerable for someone so carefully controlled. "That makes me like them, doesn't it? Like Krace using your submission, like Kade using your desperation. Just another predator taking advantage of your trauma to get what I want." Sera was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The difference is you're telling me the truth about what you're doing." Krace and Kade wrapped their exploitation in lies about love and salvation. You're not pretending to be something you're not. You're honestly saying, "I want to use your rage because your rage might save us all." At least that's honest predation. She smiled, but it was not a warm expression. "Besides, I'm not powerless anymore. If I'm being used, it's because I've chosen to be. And I'm using you back, your resources, your pack, your plan, to become something capable of destroying the people who hurt me. Maybe that makes us both predators. At least we know what we are." The plan was remarkably simple in its cruelty. Sera would return to Krace, but not as a runaway. She would return as a supplicant, a female who tried to escape, failed, and now understood the futility of resistance. Who'd learned, through 6 months of running, that there was no place in the paranormal world for a bonded female who'd rejected her bond, who wanted to come home if home would have her. Nabi created a false history for her. Letters that would appear to be from other Ravello contacts, suggesting she'd been captured by a neutral family, held briefly, then released to wander the roads. Each letter would paint a picture of a female who'd become increasingly desperate, increasingly willing to accept her original alpha's claim. The letters would find their way to the palazzo through channels that would seem natural and unsuspicious. And then Sera would show up at the gates, hollow-eyed and broken-looking, begging for asylum. Crace's ego would do the rest. He'd been denied a bonded female once. The idea of reclaiming her, of bringing her back under his control, of reestablishing his claim over her would be irresistible. She would become a trophy, proof that even escape was temporary, proof that his power was inescapable. And once she was inside, she would have access to everything. The chambers where females were held, the records of the trafficking operations, the information about which alphas were involved, which families were connected, which people needed to be taken down. She would become their spy, their insider, their shadow wolf waiting in the heart of darkness, ready to burn it all down. 2 weeks before the planned infiltration, Nabi gathered the entire Outcasts Pack for a final briefing. All 15 of them, Mara, Carlo, the others, people Sera had trained with, fought beside, learned to trust in the way that comes only from shared danger and shared purpose. "This is the mission we've been planning for 3 years," Nabi said, his voice carrying that subtle alpha resonance that commanded attention. "We have operatives positioned throughout Perugia and the surrounding regions. When Sera gives the signal, and we'll have multiple ways for her to communicate, we move simultaneously. We secure the females being held in the palazzo dungeons. We identify and incapacitate the alphas involved in the trafficking. We burn the infrastructure. We end this." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "This is likely a suicide mission. For Sera, certainly. Possibly for some of you. We all know that. And we're doing it anyway, because this is what freedom costs when you're fighting something that's woven into the fabric of the paranormal world itself." He looked at Sera directly. "The question is, are you still willing?" Sera stepped forward. "I've been running for a year," she said, her voice steady. "Running from Crace. Running from Kade. Running from the system they built. I'm done running. I'm ready to burn it down, or I'm ready to die trying. Either way, the running stops now." The pack voted to move forward. 21 paranormal beings, choosing to wage war against a system that had controlled their world for centuries. It wasn't a happy choice, but it was a unified one. Sera approached the Ravello Palazzo on foot, alone, dressed in servant's clothing that had been deliberately worn to show hardship. Her appearance was carefully constructed, hollow-eyed from months of struggling, thin from poor living, but with a subtle deference in her bearing that suggested she'd accepted her fate. The guards at the gate recognized her immediately. Word had spread through paranormal channels about her escape, about Crace's obsession with reclaiming her, about the shame of having lost a bonded female. When they brought her to Crace, his response was exactly what Nabi had predicted. His expression was a mix of triumph and predatory satisfaction. The moment he saw her, he stood, Alpha asserting dominance over the Omega who'd defied him. "Sera," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of the mate bond that still echoed in her consciousness. I've been waiting for you to understand. The world isn't safe for females like you. The only safety comes from accepting what you are and whom you belong to. She forced herself to show submission, to kneel, to speak the words that would lock her into his possession. I understand now, she said, her voice carefully broken.
I'm sorry.
I was wrong to run. I want to come home. Crace pulled her up roughly, running his hands over her in a way that made every predatory instinct in her wolf consciousness scream. But she maintained the facade. The shadow wolf, completely hidden, waiting inside human skin. He believed she'd been broken. He believed she'd finally accepted her place in his hierarchy. He had no idea that he'd just allowed the most dangerous thing in the palazzo to walk through his doors. Within the palazzo, Sera's training became reality. She moved through the estate with the deference of a servant, but her supernatural senses were cataloging everything. The security patterns, the positions of guards, the magical wards protecting certain chambers, the locations of escape routes, and most crucially, the chambers where females were held. She discovered them on her third night, in the levels beneath the main palazzo. Underground dungeons that had been specifically designed for containment. Some females were in isolation. Others were in what appeared to be conditioning chambers, spaces where Kade conducted his psychological warfare, his systematic dismantling of will. She recognized some of them from the sanctuary. Others were new captures. Some looked like they'd been there for months. The scope of the operation made her wolf consciousness burn with fury. This wasn't just Kade's processing center. This was a full trafficking operation. A factory for breaking female werewolves and selling them into eternal servitude. And Crace was just one node in the network. There were messages, correspondence. On her 5th day in the palazzo, Sera was assigned to help with the therapeutic sessions that Kade conducted with the females. This was her chance to get closer to him, to understand his operation from the inside, to position herself for the infiltration. But what she witnessed in those sessions broke something in her. Kade was extraordinarily skilled at psychological manipulation. He would sit with a traumatized female and listen to her pain with apparent genuine compassion. He would offer tools that actually seemed to help, meditation techniques, healing practices, and then gradually he would shift the nature of the sessions. He would begin to suggest that her trauma was inevitable, that accepting it was the path to peace, that resistance was what caused suffering, that if she simply accepted her place in the hierarchy, she would be safe. She watched him take females who were beginning to heal and systematically convince them that healing was pointless, that resistance was impossible, that their only hope was to accept servitude. And she watched some of them believe him. Some of them actually begin to show signs of the psychological breaking that he was working toward. It took everything she had to maintain her facade as a servant while her shadow wolf consciousness screamed in rage. This wasn't just evil. This was evil dressed up in the language of care and healing. This was predation wearing the mask of salvation. And it was everywhere, woven into every interaction, every session, every moment of apparent kindness that was actually calculated manipulation. On the 7th day, Kade confronted her in a corridor. Sera had been carefully positioning herself to avoid him, knowing that extended contact might reveal her true nature. But he'd been watching her. And on the 7th day, he moved with supernatural speed and cornered her alone. When he grabbed her, his touch was casual, confident. The touch of someone who owned what he was touching. "Hello, Sera," he said. And his voice was exactly as she remembered. Beautiful, dangerous, predatory. I've been waiting to see how long you'd maintain this charade. Sera's heart rate spiked, but she forced herself to show fear instead of defiance. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice trembling. Of course you do, Kade continued. You walk through this palazzo like you're gathering information. You study the guards, the chambers, the wards. You're trying very hard to appear broken, but your wolf consciousness gives you away. You're not here to submit. You're here to infiltrate. For a moment, panic flooded through her. Had he recognized everything? Had the plan failed before it had even truly begun? But then Kade smiled. I was wondering when you'd finally come back to me, he continued, and I allowed it. I've been watching your little underground pack in Perugia for months now. I knew you'd eventually be sent here. I've been waiting to see what you'd try to accomplish. He stepped closer. This isn't an infiltration, Sera. This is a final lesson. You're going to help me dismantle the Outcasts Pack. You're going to lead them into a trap they can't escape from. And then you're going to understand, finally, what it means to truly belong to something larger than yourself. Sera realized, with absolute clarity, that she'd walked into something more sophisticated than she'd understood. Kade had allowed her to return. He'd been watching Nabi's pack develop, and he'd been using this entire operation as a way to gather information about every werewolf in the underground network. Every outcast, every rebel, and then destroy them all. But even as that realization crashed through her, another one followed. Kade had revealed his hand too soon. He'd underestimated her ability to adapt. He'd assumed she would break at the revelation that she was being used, being played, just as she always had been. But she wasn't that version of Sera anymore. The shadow wolf didn't panic. The shadow wolf responded. In the moment that Kade was enjoying his revelation of his superiority, Sera made a choice. She didn't try to fight him alone. She didn't attempt to escape. Instead, she triggered the signal that she and Nabi had established for absolute emergency. A simple action, throwing a specific pendant out the window that overlooked the courtyard, where Mara was positioned as a servant. One signal. Ready or not, infiltrated or not, the outcasts would move. They would come. And they would find out that sometimes the best way to deal with a trap is to spring it before your enemy is ready. The response was immediate. Within minutes, fires began appearing throughout the palazzo grounds. Not random fires, carefully positioned blazes designed to create chaos and block escape routes, while leaving specific corridors open for the females to escape through. The outcasts weren't trying to burn down the building. They were burning down the system. In the confusion of the fires, Sera broke free from Kade and moved. Her shadow wolf form was fast, deadly, and completely unleashed. She moved through the palazzo, breaking open the conditioning chambers, freeing the females being held there. Mara had positioned operatives throughout the estate, servants, workers, operatives who'd infiltrated weeks before Sera arrived. They were guiding the females toward hidden passages that led to the surrounding grounds, where other outcasts would shepherd them to safety. But the bigger battle was happening in the heart of the palazzo. Other alphas were emerging, trying to suppress the fire, trying to reassert control. The Ravello security forces, both human guards and paranormal sentries, were mobilizing. And in the center of it all, Sera was moving like a storm of shadow and rage. This was what the training had been for. This was what all those months of transformation had been preparing her for. She wasn't trying to escape anymore. She was trying to destroy. Crace found her in the central courtyard as the palazzo burned around them. His expression was one of absolute fury at what she'd done. what she'd destroyed, how she'd betrayed him. He'd believed she was his property, that she'd come back to submit, that the bond between them would eventually force her compliance. But she'd turned that bond into a weapon. She'd used his own certainty against him. When he attacked her in his wolf form, massive and powerful and enraged, she met him without hesitation. The shadow wolf and the abusive alpha, finally confronting each other in direct combat. Years of suppressed rage flowed through her as she fought. Years of being told she was worthless, powerless, meant only to serve. Years of having her will violated, her consciousness invaded, her body used as property. All of it transformed into something lethal. She was smaller than him, but she was faster, more desperate, fighting for her freedom rather than fighting to maintain ownership. And when she finally brought him down, pinning him in human form against the burning stones of the palazzo courtyard, she looked him in the eye and spoke the words she'd wanted to say since the bonding ceremony. "I was never yours," she said. "My wolf was never yours. And I'm done letting you pretend that you had any right to me at all." But Crace wasn't the final confrontation. Kade emerged from the flames with an expression of almost scientific interest, as if the burning palazzo was just another experiment to observe. "Impressive," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "You've become exactly what I predicted you would become. Lethal. Ruthless. A perfect predator." Sera shifted back to human form, breathing hard, bleeding from the fight with Crace. "The difference between us," Kade continued, "is that you think this means you're free, but you're not. You've just become something more dangerous. That's not freedom, Sera. It's just a different version of what you already were." For a moment, his words almost landed. For a moment, she wondered if he was right. If in becoming lethal, in embracing the shadow wolf, she'd lost something essential. But then she realized something crucial. It didn't matter. Even if that were true, even if she had become a predator, she was a predator who chose her own path. She was a predator who was fighting for freedom instead of enforcing captivity. She was a predator with agency, and that was more freedom than she'd ever had before. When the final confrontation came, it wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. Sera, the shadow wolf, finally looking the rogue alpha in the eye and rejecting every frame he'd ever tried to construct around her existence. "You're right," she said. "I am lethal now, and I'm choosing to use that lethality to end you. That's the only freedom that matters." The fires burned through the night. By dawn, the Ravello Palazzo was ruins. The conditioning chambers were destroyed. The records of the trafficking operations were ash. Most of the females had been successfully evacuated, though some, those who'd been conditioned too thoroughly, chose to stay rather than flee into unknown freedom. It was Sera's greatest failure and deepest sorrow. But it was also the nature of systemic trauma. Some people couldn't be saved by external force. They had to choose their own liberation, and some never would. The Outcasts Pack had won. The immediate operation was a success, but victory came with a cost that Sera hadn't anticipated. Nabi had been fatally wounded in the initial breach of the palazzo gates. He'd taken a wound meant for Mara, using his own body as a shield the way he'd always used his position as leader. By the time Sera reached him, in the hidden courtyard beneath the inn, there was nothing to do but hold him as his life drained away. "You did it," he whispered, his voice growing fainter. "You became what you needed to become. You burned it down." "Don't," Sera said, her hands pressing against the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "Don't leave. We won. You're going to see what comes next." But Nabi was already gone, his eyes closing one final time, and Sera understood, finally, what the true cost of freedom was. It wasn't abstract or philosophical. It was the weight of the people who'd had to die so that you could live. It was the knowledge that every victory in war meant loss, that the price of burning down one system of predation might be the life of someone who'd loved you enough to die fighting alongside you. She held him there in the darkness, the shadow wolf finally allowing herself to cry, and understood that this was the real transformation. Not becoming lethal, but learning to live with the weight of what lethality had cost.